Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait. People are coming in from the waiting room, so we'll just wait a few seconds, make sure everybody's in before we begin. Okay, thank you. I think we can start now. Of course, there might be people coming in as we continue, but I'd like to welcome you this afternoon. We're coming live to you from Montreal, so it is afternoon for us, but from wherever you are, welcome so much to today's Leading in Uncertain Times. Of course, these are uncertain times. So the topic is definitely timely. This wonderful topic and timely topic will be presented by Dr. Robert Saggers and Robert Paris. It will be in two parts, and you'll see that as we go along. And before we get into it, I do want to talk to you a little bit about our speakers today, who I'm sure you'll find fascinating. And the first person to speak will be Dr. Robert Saggers. Dr. Robert Saggers is an educator, coach, management consultant with more than 30 years experience in organizational learning and leadership development. He was instrumental actually in starting the graduate programs of leadership at the McGill School of Continuing Studies, where he still teaches there today in leadership skills development. Accompanying Dr. Bob Saggers, we will say Bob Saggers because we have Robert and Bob, so that'll make it easier, is Robert Paris. And Robert Paris is the first and one of very few professionals in Canada to have earned their certificate in the foundations of neural leadership from the Neural Leadership Institute led by Dr. David Rock. Robert has developed, he's actually considered a pioneer in neuroscience and has supported tools and processes that challenge management practices that date back 35 years. That date back more than 50 years, I apologize. And he has 35 years of experience of combining practical management and consulting. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome them and thank them for joining here today. And they will lead you from here on out. You can actually, all participants who are watching this today, feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you will see Q&A. You may also use the chat function, but we definitely suggest the Q&A for questions. So thank you very much. Please go ahead, Dr. Saggers.
Yeah, I'm just trying to advance the slide. Yeah, there we go. So thanks, Rosalia, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you that are attending today. In my presentation, which is the first part, I'll talk about 15 minutes or so, and what I like to do is to give you some insights about leadership, in particular a different way of looking at leadership through the lens afforded by the interactive leadership model, and then talk about the current context that we're living through, and then what are some leadership actions that we all can take to navigate successfully through this difficult and unprecedented times. Literally, there are hundreds of definitions about leadership, and if you reflect for a moment, you likely have your own definition. My approach today is not to give you a definition of leadership, but rather look at what are some of the emergent common themes from different leadership definitions. And then you can look at your own definition and say, to what degree are these common themes present within your own leadership definition. One of the first things that we know about leadership, and we're coming to realize, is that leadership is a process of influence. We're influencing others either to change their attitudes, change their behaviors, but always in light of achieving a common goal. So leadership is purposeful. There's a direction. It's goal directed. But leadership occurs between people, those who choose to lead. Leadership is a choice, but also those who choose to follow particular leaderships. So it's all about a relationship. And lastly, leadership is situated. It occurs within a context. So we have examples of religious leadership, spiritual leadership, business leadership, academic leadership, and you could go on. So there are common threads, but leadership occurs not in a vacuum, but within a context. So years back, a professor, social psychologist, E.P. Hollander, came up with he was a social psychologist, and he looked at leadership and teams through 3 different lenses. And he created this Venn diagram that was subsequently adopted by Hughes, Jeanette, and Curfey in their text, Leadership Lessons of Experience. And as a Venn diagram, there's overlapping between each of the 3 components of this model. So in order to understand leadership, we not only need to look at the leader, but we also need to look at the followers as well. So as people, they're different. They come from different backgrounds. They have different experience. They have different knowledge. They have different perspectives. They have values as well, different personalities. So when we look at leadership, we need to look at the interplay between leaders and followers. And it's interesting is that followers will follow a specific leader, but also leaders also need to step away and let followers lead. So there's an interchange. So an example, in one context, I could be a leader, but in another context, I'll choose to follow because one of my followers has more experience in a specific situation than I have. So one of the examples that I always use is in terms of using a computer. So one of my daughters, she tends to be the leader. So when I have problems or questions, I'll ask her to lead, give me guidance to try to influence me. So when we talk about relationships, it's important to recognize that followership is a choice. So while leadership is a choice, followers decide to follow a specific leader. And I'll talk a little bit about what followers are looking for in leaders in just a second. The other part of the model is the situation or the context. And this is possibly the vaguest or the most ambiguous of each of the components. The context applies at different levels in different situations. So it could be at the micro level, within a specific department or a specific situation, or it could be at an organizational level, or lastly, at a societal level. So there's different requirements. So key thing to keep in mind, leaders will be effective in some situations and not effective in other situations. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the leader and the followers. Years back, Kouzes and Posner have been studying leadership for the last 30 years or so. They originally published their work in 1987. And they updated their book, The Leadership Challenge, a book that I highly recommend, in 2012. And they asked participants, literally thousands of people from around the world, what do you admire in a leader that you would willingly follow? And they provided a series of characteristics. Despite the intervening 25 years, there were only 4 where 50% or more of the respondents choose a specific characteristic. And the following were honesty, visionary, forward-looking, being competent, and being inspiring. And you'll notice the change in the percentages over the years. Honesty, forward-looking, and inspiring increased significantly. Competency increased slightly, but not that not that great. It was only 2%. And I would surmise now, as we head into, we're coming up to, we're in 2020, so it was 8 years. I would imagine that these same characteristics hold true and are probably more relevant, today. So I want to talk about the context. Some of you might be familiar with the expression VUCA. VUCA was an acronym that developed out of the U.S. military around near the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, as part of a leadership initiative within the military school at West Point. And as the world was coming out of the Cold War, we started to realize that the emerging world was going to be very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So we're living in a VUCA world, and I think the pandemic that we're looking for really exemplifies this particular situation. So I'm going to talk about each of them. When we look at volatility, we're having rapid change on a large scale. So just look at what we're doing today. Who would have thought a year ago that we would be doing a lot of webinars, we would be teaching online? So there's been a lot of impact. Things are uncertain. We can't have any decide things with a degree of precision. Things are complex as well. It lends more of a systems approach, and things are ambiguous. We're not really too sure what's going to happen. Things are vague. So what can we do when we're in a leadership role to deal with this context? First, I believe in terms of dealing with volatility, we need to have a sense of vision or purpose. We need to know where we're going. People want to have a sense of direction and purpose. We need to communicate clearly. We need to be consistent in terms of our messages. But also we need to empower others to act. We don't have the time to react quickly. We need to move it down within organizations. But in order to empower individuals and teams, we also have to clarify our expectations so that they're able to align themselves with what we expect. Dealing with uncertainty, we need to promote understanding. So when things are uncertain, we need to give people some structure, some boundaries that they feel that there are things that they could count on. There is some certainty in a very uncertain world. We need to be continual learners. Things are changing. We need to learn from experience. And in dealing with situations, we need to be adaptive. We need to be responsive. We need to be flexible. Dealing with complexity, we need to foster collaboration. We need to encourage creative problem solving. I remember Ken Blanchard saying that none of us is as smart as all of us. So we need to engage, we need to involve others. We need to trust teams to deal and work their way through the complexity. We also need to take a systems view of things. Things are interconnected. If we look at one variable, that might have an effect on another variable. And lastly, we need to deal with ambiguity. So we need, as I mentioned before, we need to be agile, we need to be flexible. But it's important that we involve others, we question people, we listen to what they're saying. We also need to manage paradoxes. So it's not a question of, in our current context, people's wellness and people's health, but it's also people's economic well-being as well. So it's not a case of either or, we really need to manage both. And this will take time and effort and readjustment. And lastly, we need to look at focus on incremental achievements. One of the biggest problems that we're having now living through COVID-19 is people want to see large changes. We are moving from a closed to a open aspects. And we need to be careful. So we need to look at small wins rather than big wins. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation, and just before passing the mic to Bob, I want to just summarize. What I think we need to do is we need to move more from a leader-centric to an interactive view of leadership. Leadership is not only about the leader, but it's about the followers, and it's about the context. Also, we're looking for leaders who are honest, forward-looking, inspirational, and competent. The world in which we're living is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in order to address this situation, leaders need to be purposeful, emotionally intelligent, continual learners, and adaptive in order to succeed in these changing times. So now I'll pass the mic to my colleague, Robert Paris, and I'll be pleased to answer your questions after Robert's presentation.
Okay, go ahead, Robert. Oh, Robert, your mute is on. Sorry, if you could just unmute yourself. Robert, I'm sorry, if you could unmute yourself. You're on mute, so just click the mute button.
Unmute.
There you go.
Okay, so I will now go back to sharing the screen.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, just let's go on. So is that on in terms of the screen?
The screen is not on. We hear you perfectly now. So.
Okay, just hold on.
Yeah, it's coming. I see that it's coming. There you go. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just trying to, just having some technical difficulties trying to shift. No, we're going to, okay, hold on. Okay, great. So sorry about that, adjusting everybody, but thanks, and thank you, Bob, for introducing this term VUCA world and talking about the current pandemic environment and what everybody is going through right now. What I like to do is an extension of that to say, well, in the VUCA world, with all the anxiety that lives that we're all experiencing right now, what's the impact on the brain, and how is that related to leadership? So with that in mind, the objectives here is to understand the impact of stress and anxiety on the brain. It's to link your belief systems to your mental and physical health, because there's quite a link there that I think you'll find interesting. Then learn how to change your belief systems. I think you're going to find that quite fascinating, and relate all of this to a concept I call daring leadership. So the question that I'm often asked, and I ask people, is what's the purpose of the brain? And while there's literally thousands of answers to that, it's important to understand that the brain is all about survival, to minimize threat and maximize reward. And once you understand that basic concept, if you will, then you understand a lot about your own behavior and the behavior of other people. So let's keep that in mind. The brain is all about survival. Very relevant, one of the threats to our survival is what we call chronic emotional stress. So I think it's really important to understand from the brain's perspective, emotional pain equals physical pain. So in other words, if you were stabbed, there's neural mechanisms in the brain that take over to try to deal with it. Well, if you're feeling emotional pain or even social isolation that many of us are feeling right now, the same neural mechanisms take place. So again, the emotional pain that we're feeling is actually a threat to the brain. Now, when I talk about chronic stress, I'm not talking about acute stress, because actually acute stress is quite good for us. If we're preparing for an exam, preparing for a presentation, or preparing before a swim meet, that's all really good. We call that acute stress. Chronic stress, however, is when day after day after day, we're feeling stress. And think about the pandemic. A lot of us are in that mental state right now. So what happens when we're under chronic stress? Chronic stress overloads the brain circuits. In point of matter, the human brain, it has very limited cognitive capacity. And when we're hour after hour, day after day under stress, it taxes the brain, leading to a lot of fatigue. It also, the problem is that day after day, when we're pessimistic and negative, and we're always thinking what's going to happen in the future, and we're negative about that, we're actually building circuits in the brain that are going to make us more prone in the future to negativity and skepticism. So that's one thing. Another thing to keep in mind is when we're under chronic stress, we have what we call negative neurochemicals that pulse through our body. Cortisol, adrenaline, histamines, etc. But cortisol is really the stress hormone. So again, in these uncertain VUCA times, day after day, when cortisol is running through our body, take a look at the effects on the body. Chronic fatigue, it lowers our immune system. It can relate to depression, arthritis, and all kinds of things. So we have to be really careful in terms of the current environment that we take control of our brains and not vice versa. So all this to say, in the current environment that we're now experiencing, we must be able to show our own leadership and deal with chronic emotional stress. That's really everything. And that's what we're living now on a daily basis. Leaders must take control of this stress themselves, but for their followers as well. So what are some of the coping mechanisms? One of them is, first of all, don't fight your anxiety, accept it. A lot of people try to deny it, or no, this isn't really happening. And my recommendation is just accept it and then label it. So if you're feeling anxiety, say, I'm feeling anxious, or I'm negative, I'm feeling angry, I'm disappointed. Whatever it is, it's very important that you let your rational brain on so that you label the emotion, and that will calm your emotional brain. But the other really important thing to do is to change your belief system. And we have a tremendous amount of work right now that tells us actually our beliefs are our destiny. And I'm going to get into that. But that's the focus, if I want to say, is now as leaders, we have an opportunity to change our belief systems. So you see on the screen a great quote, you are what you believe yourself to be. As I said before, your beliefs are your destiny. So as leaders, it's critically important that we get in touch with our beliefs, because if our beliefs are negative, that's going to impact on our leadership style. So it's really important that we understand what our beliefs are. And I'm going to get into that in a little more detail here. So to change your beliefs, and I think a lot of us have to do that in this environment of uncertainty and stress and anxiety. The first thing is what motivational speakers have been telling us for years and years and years, is to think positive. It is so easy right now to take a look at an uncertain future because the brain craves certainty, but none of us really are facing certain situations. What's going to happen with COVID-19? Is it going to be over next month, the month after that? Is it going to be a second wave? Is it going to last a year or 2 years? There's a ton of uncertainty. So again, the brain will be prone to negativity. And so it's really important to understand that and start thinking positive. Start thinking in terms of gratitude and what's going right. Try to imagine a more compelling future. Rethink what you're doing, your occupations, your businesses. It's a tremendous opportunity to do that, and we have to do that, train our brain to think positive. However, thinking positive simply is not enough, and research proves that's quite conclusively. So other than thinking positively, you must get in touch with your hidden story. And all of us have hidden stories that are unconsciously embedded in our brains. And I want to just tell a brief fictitious story just to illustrate my point. Take Johnny. Johnny is 4 or 5 years of age and is experiencing his parents, who are very, very tense. Their parents are fighting all the time, often leave him alone. Well, to Johnny, his parents are his source of survival. And again, the brain's all about survival. All of a sudden, Johnny has a threat to his survival and might be getting a message, I'm not good enough. My parents don't love me. And that is, again, an emotional threat to Johnny's survival. So what does Johnny do? The brain develops coping mechanisms to deal with the fact that Johnny isn't really feeling very good about himself. So as he grows up, gets into adolescent years, he starts to bully others in the schoolyard. So what happens is that Johnny's story that he's not good enough, along with the coping mechanism that now I bully and get aggressive with people, gets unconsciously embedded in Johnny's brain, aware of what's going on. So that's why getting in touch with that hidden story becomes so positive, and get in touch with your hidden story that I'd like to refer to. Your beliefs are your destiny, as I mentioned before. And I have a quote here based on Dr. Bruce Lipton, who's author of a brilliant book called The Biology of Belief. And Dr. Lipton said, positive thoughts have a profound effect on behavior and genes, but only when they are in harmony with subconscious programming. And negative thoughts have an equally powerful effect. What Dr. Lipton, who's a microcell biologist, was able to prove, first of all, the human body has 50 trillion cells. And if you're thinking negative thoughts, if that's what your belief system is, it literally impacts the health environment, could lead to mental and health issues down the road. But the opposite is also there. If you're thinking positively and you're in touch with your hidden story, then that positively impacts the mental and your mental and physical health by impacting positively the environment of each one of the 50 trillion cells. So again, your beliefs are your destiny. Critically important to get in touch with what those beliefs are all about. So let's tie this all into leadership. Many of you may have heard of the work of Brene Brown. And if you haven't, I strongly suggest that you go to YouTube, that you Google her name. She has enduring leadership is our armor. The thoughts, emotions, and behaviors
Robert, I'm so sorry, but we're having some technical issues. So I would ask that maybe you turn your camera off to expand your bandwidth and to maybe just start over on that slide, as some people didn't hear all of that. Thank you so much.
your hidden stories. So what that means, really importantly, is that you get in touch with what are the hidden stories like our little boy Johnny had. Johnny has to get in touch with what his story is. And that's a form of what we call daring leadership, because Johnny has to understand the impact of his parents and what the impact has been in the workplace or in the classroom or with what his peers are. So it's critically important that each and every one of you identify, then get comfortable telling and living your hidden stories. That's the path forward to leadership development and to positive mental and physical health. But it's not an easy thing to do, because in essence, when we show vulnerability, it really is a threat to us. It literally is, the brain appears to a threat, that if I tell my real story and show vulnerability, are people going to take advantage to me? So it goes against our innate nature to be able to do that. And yet that's exactly why we talk about daring leadership. In essence, to really fulfill your leadership destiny, going to be critically important that you get in touch with that story, that Johnny story, that what actually holds you back. And then once you get comfortable with it, you start to make links between your story and negative behaviors in your professional and personal lives. So it's critically important that you get in touch with what that inner story is. And I'd like to leave you with some concrete things you could do to do exactly that. Okay. Okay, so hold on, I'm just gonna change this. Okay, getting in touch with your hidden story. This is something I really recommend each of you to do, to really develop yourself as a leader. Find a quiet and peaceful place and prepare to tell your story, but using your emotional brain. Because normally when we tell our stories, we are in the logical part of our brain and not really the emotional part of the brain. And the way to do that is to divide your life into 3 segments. The first is childhood, under 10 years of age. Tell your story and don't be afraid to get in touch with some of the pain that you felt. It might not be an easy thing, but in order to understand how you're behaving and leading others today, that really is critically important. So much of the stress that we feel emanates from our early years. And then our adolescent years were very anxious and stressful as well. So getting in touch with some of the social pressures we faced in those days becomes very important. And then get in touch with your adult years. Really important to dig deep down inside. And one of the ways to do that is to use old photos to help you tell your story. So go back to photos when you were a little kid and take a look. How did you look in those photos? Did you appear anxious? Did you appear fearful? Get in touch with what's going on with the traumatic events that you experienced in your life. Yes, that's difficult to do, but in order to develop into a complete leader, it's critical that you understand that, and because what are the unconscious thoughts in your brain that are really leading you to behave as you do? One of the most powerful things we could do is to journal, and I highly recommend that. Spend 20 days daily writing about your story. Go back to your early years and try to identify what were the traumatic events that I experienced then. Go right into your teen, your adolescent years, and then your adult years. 20 minutes a day, every day, and there's a ton of research that says if you do that, it has a great impact on and a positive impact on your mental health. Highly recommend journaling. So make links between key life events and self-defeating behaviors you are exhibiting. That's critically important. And then share your story with other people. And that is really courageous leadership. And that's a lot of what we're talking about in the leadership world, is getting in touch with those unconscious stories and becoming comfortable telling them. Because when you tell your authentic story, it has an incredible impact on others. So just to summarize before our Q&A period, the brain is all about survival. We're not built to deal with chronic emotional stress. Your beliefs are your destiny. So you've got to get comfortable changing your beliefs, engaging in both positive thinking and getting in touch with that hidden story, as difficult as that might be. And then finally, a daring leadership involves identifying, sharing, and telling your real stories. So I want to thank you right now, and I'll turn it over to Rosalia.
Thank you, Robert. Now, I would just ask you, Robert, while we're getting the questions set up, if you don't mind sharing your screen, just to show the last few slides, if that's possible, because we were asked in the chat to do that.
Okay,
So
why
no problem.
it's not on right now?
No, so take your time to bring that back on while we look at questions. I'd like to thank Dr. Bob Saggers and Robert Paris for this presentation. I now invite your questions, and we apologize for the technical issues. I'm sure you've been Zooming long enough to know that these sometimes happen. So as you're sitting from home and have Zoomed for the past month or more, you understand that, but we do apologize very much. So as Robert gets those screens back up, because some of you asked to see them, I invite your questions through the Q&A feature. So do we have any questions right now? Okay, so I was curious to ask you a question. Robert, I was wondering about your familiarity and how you connect your work with some of the things that Brene Brown has talked about in terms of vulnerability and leadership and daring leadership.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, there's no question Brene Brown has had a tremendous impact on us as well in talking about this kind of courageous kind of leadership. Brene, and by the way, you can Google her. She has tons of videos and TED Talks and whatever. But at the end of the day, I think what Brene is saying, leadership is all about courage. It's about telling what your inner story is, because we want to be able to follow authentic leaders and to come across as being authentic. And if people perceive that you're not being authentic, that becomes problematic. So being able to step back and reach back into your childhood, tell your actual story, show vulnerability, show that you're human, actually is really critically important as becoming a real authentic leader. And that empowers others within your group, other leaders, other followers, if you will, in your group to tell that story. And I could tell you, I've done this with clients many, many times. And as difficult as it might be to tell your story, when people actually do it, it's absolutely liberating and empowering.
Yeah, maybe I could just build upon what Robert was saying. One of the concepts that Brene Brown talks a lot about is vulnerability. So as a leader, you need to be vulnerable. You need to admit that you don't have all of the answers. You're struggling as well as your people are struggling. And as Bob says, you need to be authentic. Followers are looking towards leaders who are honest. And in order to be honest, you need to be courageous. You need to say it like it is. You need to be consistent. And people won't follow leaders that they believe are inauthentic or phony.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for adding that. We now have some questions here. I have a question on, do you have any guidance for how to deal with followers? So people under your, who report to you or another, what is the context of leadership that is, who are negative thinkers or have a negative or combative attitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people, in terms of dealing with followers, that I like to use the term challenging. And they're a challenge. And I guess the key thing is to listen to them. Why are they challenging? It could be because some of their own needs are not being met in terms of a relationship. With you, engage in open dialogues. Tell them your perceptions. Try to find out where are they coming from. And it's interesting, and I always say, with people that are challenging, they could be challenging for you, but working with another leader or another manager, they could be exemplary, followers. So it depends upon what you're looking for. But the key thing, I believe, it's dialogue. Barry Posner, who I referred to before, the co-author of the Leadership Challenge, has a TED Talk video, and in it he says, you make a difference as a leader, but you can't do it alone. So how do you deal with challenging followers? You know, listen to them. Try to look at things from their perspective. And I like to use the expression as well, you need to be passionate about what you believe in and what you're striving for, but you also need to be compassionate with others. And if others, the followers, feel that you're actually listening to them and you care about them, then you'll be able to turn them around.
And I'd
Yeah.
like to, Bob, great advice. There's absolutely no question about it. And I'd like to look at a brain perspective of that as well. I'm involved in a field called neuro leadership, which actually teaches people how their brains work and how does that relate to leading yourself and leading others. What's really fascinating, here's something that I think is interesting. The brain has 5 times the number of neural mechanisms related to negativity than positivity. We are meant to be negative, and that's for survival reasons. And I can get into a whole set of reasons why that is true, but that's actually how our brain is wired. So we have a tendency to be negative. That's why you might see people around the water cooler, those of us who can go into offices and be around water coolers these days, but the virtual water cooler, if you will, notice after anything, a presentation or a new idea, we tend to be negative. Why didn't that work? And our brains are set up that way from a neurological perspective. So we have to take control of our brains. If we find ourselves getting into a negative cycle, we have to stop right away and literally use the terminology. We're getting into a negativity cycle here. Let's stop it and let's see what's positive. In fact, before we come up with anything that's negative, why do each of us state 3 things that are positive about this situation? And I think if we do that, we can overcome our negativity. We could literally wire our brains to be positive. So going forward in an organization, building a culture, that's one way to build a very, very positive environment and culture.
And actually on that question, I'd ask both of you, what's one thing you can both name that has been positive about the situation?
Okay, well, I'll go. I know I have a business, Rosalie, and I could tell you, I had 4 big projects going at the beginning of February. I was about to start on, and of course they all finished. It involved classroom training and all of that stuff, and every one of those projects were dead. You can imagine how I impacted, because probably at that point over 90% of my business was gone. However, I chose to look at it, what an amazing opportunity. And what I've done over the last 8 weeks is totally rethink my business. How can I do what I do in a virtual world? How could I reach out? What are new services I can offer? And so I have found this rather to be stressful, to be quite liberating in terms of now I have an opportunity to reinvent myself and do other things.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, one of the things, and I'm really always amazed at the resilience of people, and not only the acts of kindness, but also the acts of leadership. There's a lot of leadership going on when we look at people manning the food banks and taking care of seniors, and there's a whole slew of things. So we need to look at the positive aspects. From a personal viewpoint, it's interesting. While we tend to be more disconnected because of distancing, social distancing, we're actually becoming more connected through technology. A couple of examples. My wife has reconnected with some of her close childhood friends that they went to school with. And now every Monday, they have a 2-hour Zoom session. And if it wasn't, it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for COVID. So here she's reconnecting and they're sharing stories from the past. And we're meeting people when we go out for our socially distanced corrected walks. We're meeting neighbors that we haven't met before, and we say hello, and then we start realizing So there's a next door neighbor just on the back of me, one door down. I've never met before, and he's lived here for 30 years, and I've lived here for 30 years. And we started talking, and then we found out, how many people we know together. He worked for one of my past clients, so we started exchanging names, and wow, this wouldn't have happened. And it's forcing us as well to reconnect. So people that we've been meaning to contact, that we've tended to put off because of our, situation. We never have time. Well, now we have the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that speaks a lot to the idea that it's physical distance, not social distancing, right? So
That's right.
okay, wonderful. We have a lot of questions, so we'll get to the next one. I'm wondering how we balance validating the experiences of our employees or students with encouraging positivity.
Well, yes. And I'd like to talk about that again because, as I said before, we have a tendency to be negative, and in this pandemic, right? Yes, all of us obviously have a lot of stress and anxiety. Now, one of the key factors here is that the brain craves certainty. And we know that there's a whole bunch of research about that, and yet we're dealing in times of uncertainty. But the great thing that we know is that we can take control of our brains. That's the wonderful, beautiful thing, because the emotional part of the brain is kind of first on the thinking stage, if you will. And we tend to react with stress and anxiety in terms of negativity, and the worst is going to happen. We take a look at the future. We don't know what it's going to look like. So we automatically tell negative stories and we get really, really anxious. But one of the things we learned is that you can take control of your brain. You can literally tell your brain, stop that. In essence, I know there's been many, many other disasters in the world, dating back to the last century and right now that we felt it was the end of the world. Nuclear warfare, we've had outbreaks of diseases before. Many things have happened and we've always gotten over it. So I think it's priming the brain to be positive. It's important to admit what your feelings are, but then it's to look forward and to say, no, I think things are going to be better. I have an opportunity to reinvent myself right now because I know we will come out of this at the other end and we'll all be better off.
Wonderful. Dr. Sagers, did you want to answer that as well?
Yeah, maybe, and just the question, or this notion of balance. I think we all need to have balance within our lives, and we need to recognize that our lives, for various reasons, are in an imbalanced state right now. So we need to create routines for ourselves. We need to create routines for people that we're working with. I'm currently coaching, excuse me, currently coaching several people. And one of the realities that they've had to deal with is, how do you lead people remotely? And I think one of the key things we need to realize is that a lot of times people don't need to be controlled. People are willing to work, they're engaged. The key thing is you need to be connected with them. You need to let them know that you're there, that you're supporting them. And the key thing is creating contact. Because at a distance, people feel that they're disconnected. So you need to reach out, just if it's just a call on a weekly basis, or having team weekly meetings, just so people can get together, that they know that they're part of something bigger, that they're working together, they're overcoming some of the challenges.
Bob,
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just like to build on that.
Yeah.
Like something interesting just came to mind, because the future, as we say, in the next year or two, is more people are going to be working in isolation at home. And in fact, that represents quite a threat to the brain, because we happen to be very social animals. So I think one of the things as business leaders and as academic leaders that we're going to have to grapple with is the impact of not, instead of working in teams, of working individually at home and not having social contact. So I think that's one of the things as a society that we're going to really have to address. That's really critically important.
Yeah, I think, and one of the things that technology to a certain extent will help. I know a lot of my clients are either using Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Skype. They're getting together, and there's, I think there's a comfort level with the technology as well. It's going to take a time, but sitting here, it's like I'm in a room and I'm talking to you, and there's people also that are listening in. So we need to force ourselves into routines that we reach out, we connect. We also, need to make a practice of it, a habit of it, because normally we wouldn't do it. Because in an office we walk in, we say hello to people, and they're there. But when you don't go into an office every day, as Robert's mentioning, people need that social connection, because we are social animals, and we like to congregate, and we like to have fun. And one of the things, on my Apple phone, they actually tell you now how much time you're spending on your phone. The percentage of your day on your phone. And guess what? Over the last 2 months, it's gone up because I'm checking Facebook, I'm checking LinkedIn, I'm reaching out. So I guess the key thing is that even though we're physically apart, we're not socially apart. We can reach out. And I think we need to force ourselves, that some time to do that. Other questions?
Yeah, we definitely have other questions.
Okay.
So first, we have a comment. Thank you for a wonderful webinar. Do you have any suggestions for leaders navigating cross-generational teams?
Yeah, and I from my perspective, we need to learn more. We need to question more, especially from a cross-generational perspective. When we look at cross-generational teams, and really where it works is where people are more experienced. I won't use the term older, but they have more experience to mentor, to coach younger people, but also to get the younger people to coach the older people as well, in terms of the use of technology. A great example by Jack Welch. When GE was moving into the computer age, he went down into his organization and got a young engineer who was an expert in internet technology to actually coach and help him learn. So we could balance that. We could learn from each other, but we need to be willing to learn. We also need to be willing to listen as well.
Hey, great advice, Bob. And I want to build on that as well. And I think part of what we can do cross-generationally is tell stories. And I think stories are something that they're passed on through the generations, but stories talk of our humanity. It allows us to express ourselves. It allows us to better understand ourselves. So if you're in a younger cohort dealing, let's say, with the 65 plus, you both have interesting stories. You have different perspectives. And too often we fail to get together with each other, and we fail to connect. And one of the things, if we just sit around and just share our stories, we share our common humanity. And when we share our common humanity, there's actually oxytocin is released in the brain, which is the bonding chemical, if you will. That's one of the ways, because there's so much sometimes tension between generations, right? Well, the younger generation won't do this or the whole bit. The reality is, when we sit around and we tell stories and we understand each other and we start to build oxytocin and bonds between us, it's incredible what the impact is on teams, on families, any groups of people.
And Robert, would you be intentional about this, like set aside time to do this with the team, or is this something you should just the team should learn to do just on a more organic basis? Or should you actually set aside time?
You want to address that, Robert?
Oh, I think he's frozen.
Okay, he's frozen. Okay, so I'll address it then.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and it's a great team building activity where people start to open up. It needs to be properly done, but you start doing that, and then you start relating specific stories to specific situations. People learn not only directly, but they also learn vicariously as well. So they could learn about what to do and what not to do based on stories that people tell.
Right.
You know, and I look at through my career, I benefited from the stories of elders of what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. So you learn about the culture of the organization through stories people tell. A great book that was written several years ago by a professor at Harvard, a guy by the name of Howard Gardner, and he wrote a book called Leading Minds. And basically, he took a cognitive approach to leadership, is that leadership and leaders lead through the stories they tell, but also they embody those particular stories as well. So they're authentic, you know, that's what we were talking about before.
And
I'm glad to see you're unfrozen, Robert.
I'm unfrozen now, but Bob, thanks for unfreezing me, if you will. Yeah, the marvels of technology, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, in answer to your question, I think I deal a lot in the corporate, but also the academic sector as well. And I think storytelling has to be intentional. We have to make time. Too often in organizations, I go into and look at team after team after team. They're task focused. They're not focused on each other. They're not focused on building those interpersonal bonds. And that becomes problematic. So what I know when working with my clients, we're very clear that we set a time, could be 5% of time, 10% of time, whatever it is, intentionally to be able to sit around. And I could tell you the past couple of years, I sat down with management teams, executive teams, all kinds of teams and organizations, and we made it intentional. We actually taught them how their brains work, why it's important to tell your story, but engaged in an exercise that people could tell their story. And I have to caution here, because most people, when they tell their story, will do it from the rational part of the brain and leave out the emotions. So what we try to do as part of the intentional storytelling process is to introduce photos into the storytelling process. Because when you tell your story through photos, it literally lights up areas of the brain related to emotion. So you're telling your story not just from the rational brain, but from the emotional brain. And I could tell you team after team after team I've worked with in the last half dozen years, when they get together and they tell their authentic stories using their emotional brains as well, it's incredible how people start to bond and form as authentic teams.
That could be a little bit like children doing show and tell, right? If they're showing what they're, and it brings back memories, I guess that works in a similar way.
We certainly do, and I'm glad you brought up kids, because kids do all this stuff normally, and unfortunately, as we get into adulthood and our brains form, we have all these barriers or whatever. So we have a lot to learn from the kids of the world, because very often in telling their stories, they get it right.
Excellent. So we have more questions to get to.
Maybe I could just add a little part
absolutely.
to that.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of storytelling, it relates to emotional intelligence. You know, in terms of the dimensions of emotional intelligence, people that are emotionally intelligent are self-aware, but they're able to regulate themselves and manage themselves. But also they understand others as well. And when you involve stories, you get to understand other people's, where are they coming from? What is their perspective? And you'll get answers to why they're maybe challenging for you. Their stories are different than yours, but you need to manage those relationships.
And Bob, I agree with you. I've been an advocate. We should probably have some kind of storytelling institute where people can get together and tell their real stories. I don't know, maybe that could be a McGill initiative or something, but the power of storytelling is just incredible.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of storytelling. When I get feedback from my students, one of the things they always mention is the stories.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I'm a former student. I can attest to that. Absolutely. Okay, next question. Can you shed any light on the phenomenon of bad leadership, in quotes, and how some people willfully follow leaders who are dishonest, incompetent, not forward-thinking, etc.?
Yeah, there's a great book by a professor at Harvard, Barbara Kellerman, and she talks about bad leadership. And if you Google her, she's done some TED Talks about bad leadership. And what she's done, she's actually created a taxonomy of bad leadership. And what she does is she refers to the interactional framework model that I discussed earlier, and she looks at it as a web of leadership. And guess what? Bad leaders are supported by followers. Bad leaders, flourish because they have a following. We don't have to look further than south of the border, to appreciate that. And if there aren't any Americans in the audience today, I apologize. But you look at a substantial following. So people will. There's a concept called enabling. They will enable bad leaders. And what good leaders do is actually have followers that challenge them, that help them not make bad decisions. By being both an advocate for their position, but also assertive as well. So there's a relationship between followers and leaders. I sometimes say that followers get the leaders they deserve.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So Bob, do you want to add to that as
Yeah,
well?
for sure, Bob. Like when it comes to bad leaders, and I've often called in by clients, founders of organizations or whatever, to deal with a so-called bad leader, and that's really tough to do. And again, there's a reason why somebody becomes a bad leader, why they're aggressive with people or whatever. And again, it kind of, my presentation, it goes back to their usually childhood years. Like the story I told of Johnny, that fictitious story, who becomes aggressive with people in the schoolyard, it becomes hardwired in Johnny's brain and might be that bad leader that you just talked about. So what we have to do is if the leader, the bad leader, is motivated, and that's really important because often they're in positions of power and they don't want to change. But if they're motivated to change, then we can work through a process where we get them to tell their story using photos, as I referred to before, going right back to childhood to try to get in touch with why are they acting that way? How is their brain wired? So once they start to tell their story, and that's the exercise I gave earlier, once we start to go through that and they start to understand that, yeah, maybe it's because I had parents that were screaming, or I had other social traumas as teens. Once they start to understand that, then they make link between that behavior and the negative behavior in the workplace, and that's a critical step. After that, we go through a process that we literally rewire the brain. We get them to write their own script, a very self-affirming script that basically says, I realize I have defective brain wiring, but I no longer will let my brain control me. I'm going to take control of my brain. I know I'm strong and positive, and they continue with their script. We have them repeat that script twice a day, every day for 60 days. And what we're doing is building new brain wiring that can override the old brain wiring. And the results we're getting with this, absolutely fantastic. However, and just to end, however, the so-called bad leader, they have to be motivated to do that. Because if they're not going to go through the process. That becomes a problem. And as the follower, you have to ask yourself, do I want to remain a member of this team?
Absolutely. And so if a leader is motivated, in as little as 60 days, they could rewire their brain if they're committed to the process.
Yes, and I can tell you the most difficult stories of people who we've worked with who were really the founder of organizations that come and said, wow, there's really there's a problem. This person is brilliant, the manager, the executive is brilliant, but it's turning other people off, right? Now, in that case, the so-called bad leader has no choice. And so when we talk about the process, what you see is when they start to tell their story, there's initial resistance, but then it's like, wow, I'm starting to learn about myself. So when we go through the process, and yes, they repeat every day for 60 days, twice a day. If they miss one day, they have to go right back to day one, because that interferes with brain wiring. But if they do that twice a day, every day for 60 days, the results that we've experienced are just incredible.
Well, that's fascinating.
Just building upon what Robert's saying, one of the fascinating things about our brain is a concept called brain plasticity. You know, and it's easier to learn new behaviors than it is to stop ingrained behavior. So we all have default systems. So learning something new is easier. And the key thing is I'm a firm believer. People ask me, how do you motivate others? And I say, you can't really motivate others. What you can do is create the conditions, the situation in which they become self-motivated. And when they're self-motivated and they open themselves up, you get some of the effects, you know, that Robert's talking about.
Great, thank you for answering that. I said that's all very fascinating. And is this one last thing on this? Just curious, is this something you can do yourself? So Robert, if you want to change a behavior from something that you're in your thought is negative to positive, by doing the exercise that you brought up, is this something you can do yourself? For yourself?
Yes. I mean, it certainly. I mean, I think the first thing that we could all do is we have to be open. And the first thing is to and open and motivated. You have to really want to change. The problem is if you're not motivated to do that and somebody requests that you do it, you're not likely to follow through. But if you're motivated to discover what your story is, absolutely. And the first thing, as I said before, let your rational brain take over from your emotional brain. So when you're feeling anger or negative behaviors, you can, as I said before, just recognize that, accept it, and label it, and then start to tell your story. And a very good way, as I mentioned in my presentation, to tell your story is go back to old photo albums. They're fascinating. I did that, and I started going back to old photos, and I saw myself as a 4 or 5-year-old kid really cowering. You know, my father was a big, imposing guy. And I just tried to put myself in the place of a 4-year-old, which was me. How would I normally feel at the time? And I had a lot of empathy for myself, whereas most of my life I was very hard on myself. So yes, you can go through the exercise, accept it, label, get old photos, and as I said before, divide your life into 3 segments. Go back, use your emotional and your rational brain to tell your story, get in touch with those feelings, and make links between those stories and what you're feeling today. It's always a little better with a professional because there are ways to guide to do that. And by the way, this isn't about psychology as well. We don't do deep dives into psychology. We just, through visual stimuli, get people to tell their stories. So you can try it on your own for sure. But if there's, and by the way, one of the things I want to say, if people have real problems in the case of bad leaders, there may have been abuse as kids. And in that, I just want to leave people with the thought, those people need professional help. And I think it's very critical to understand that.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for making that distinction. Do you both have time for a few more questions, or?
Sure. I have time. How about you, Robert?
I do. I'm fine, sure.
Okay, great. Let's go to the next one. How is vulnerability strong, and how can it become a positive label when this weakness, i.e. chronic illness, is misunderstood by others? So you did touch on this before, but would you like to expand on that?
So as I understand, so the question is about vulnerability. Can I?
Because it's perceived as a weakness. So how do you make this into seem like a strength?
One of
Right, and
the
I,
one of the things that I when I talk to students about vulnerability is you need to be authentic. You need to let others know what you're not good at. Uh, we all have strengths, but we all have weaknesses as well. So a lot of my students, know what my weaknesses are because I tell them. And they see it. So I'm inattentive to details sometimes. So I let people know this, and they appreciate that because I'm weak there, and I have students that will correct things that I've written or will say this doesn't make sense, and I thank them. If I didn't admit that vulnerability, I wouldn't have gotten that feedback. There's a caveat though. When you're in a leadership role, you need to use judgment in terms of what you share, what you admit in terms of your vulnerability, because you don't want to be perceived as incompetent. So you need to use judgment in terms of what you share. Some people share too much, some people don't share at all. So there's this notion of balance.
what
So
wise words, Bob.
yeah.
No question about it. And I always take, of course, the look from the brain's perspective, the neuro perspective. It is against our evolutionary biology to be vulnerable. Right, because that becomes a
Yep.
threat. And as I stated earlier, emotional pain equals social pain equals physical pain. It's the exact same thing. So when we tell our story and show vulnerability, it goes against our natural instincts because we fear the other person or people are going to use that against us. That's why Brene Brown calls this daring and courageous leadership. It takes tremendous courage to be able to go back, tell your story, admit mistakes that you've made, admit stories that weren't exactly flattering to you, and to actually, first of all, identify that, let alone share that. So that's what we're talking about, courageous and daring leadership. And keep in mind, do we follow, and Bob, you mentioned the word authentic, do we follow inauthentic leaders who just talk off the top of their mind and really aren't human? No, we don't. But we tend to connect with leaders who tell their authentic story. They admit that they're human. They admit that they made mistakes because we're all human. We all can relate to that. Those are the leaders we tend to gravitate towards. So yes, it goes against our biology to tell our stories, but I encourage everyone to do exactly that and show daring and courageous leadership.
Yeah, one of the things that I'll like to add to that is a quote that I use that came from a Canadian consultant, a guy called Harris, and he talked about the learning paradox. And he says what we need to become comfortable with the discomfort of learning. So when we admit vulnerability and we admit that we don't know something, um, we need to be comfortable because that creates discomfort. It goes against the grain. But once we do that, paradoxically, we become stronger because people see that, they relate to that, and they will act in ways differently than we think they're going to act. They're not going to use it as a power over us, but they're going to be more willing to help us because we're more human. And leadership is a connection, a very sometimes complex decision between those who choose to lead and those who choose to follow. And people have different backgrounds, different histories, and they'll follow different people. They sometimes, unfortunately, from my perspective, will not always make an enlightened choice, but it's a choice nonetheless. And we need to recognize this. So when we learn something new, we start recognizing is now that we know something that we didn't know before, but that creates disruption. So we need to act on that disruption. And in this day and age, especially in a VUCA world, we need to be continual learners. Learning never stops. We need to learn from daily experiences. Robert just gave his own personal story in terms of COVID, re-evaluating his own practice. His practice is changing.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And there's no question when I get started with individuals, right, who want to get involved in the storytelling process and go back to childhood, there's always a ton of resistance, right? Because again, it could result in a lot of emotional pain. But I could tell you, everyone who was motivated to do it and went through the process and then to rewire their brains, it's absolutely liberating to them and to the people around them. The change in their mental outlook and their behaviors is incredible. So that's why I'm saying, as a leadership necessity, we have to get in touch. We have to have the courage to identify our inner stories and then to share them to the degree that we're comfortable, right? And then to live them. And once we do that from a leadership perspective, it's positively enlightening.
Well,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Robert and I have worked extensively over the years, and I know that one of Robert's favorite authors is a guy called Bill George, and Authentic Leadership. And I just yesterday I Googled VUCA. And I came across, he came up with a VUCA 2.0, and he focused VUCA in terms of a VUCA leader or a VUCA manager, and the V stands for vision. So we've talked about this understanding. You need to understand the context. You need to understand others, but courage, the courage to be vulnerable, the courage to act, but also you need to be adaptable as well. So I thought that was kind of neat, so a new twist on VUCA, but from the leadership or manager perspective.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And speaking of adaptability, thank you to both of you for using technology to connect with our audience. We're over time, and I thank you so much for staying longer. We have so many more questions that will be unanswered, but I'm afraid we could talk for the rest of the day, and we'd still have questions. Thanks to all of you out there in the audience for joining us at Virtual School of Continuing Studies. We appreciate your questions, and we're sorry we didn't get to all of them. Do you have any closing words, Dr. Sagers, Robert Paris?
Yeah, I just I want to thank the audience. One of the realities of working virtually, especially with large audiences, that we can't see everybody. One of the things as a presenter I strive on is contact with the audience. But I'm glad in terms of the response, in terms of the questions and the ability to to elaborate. Bob's slide is not up, and I was trying to put my slides.
I could put mine.
Yeah, because there's another session that you should mention as well, eh?
Here we go. I'm gonna get that.
Great. Anything?
Can you see my screen?
So, yeah, I can see your screen. I can see it moving ahead. Yeah.
Perfect.
Questions. And
there we go.
And there we go.
So while you're doing that,
go ahead, Robert.
Yeah. Okay. Just again, as a summary from my perspective, we're living in very, very uncertain times. And I think Bob shared with you a lot of very practical tips in terms of how you do that. I try to bring in the brain perspective. And I guess my final thing is that, again, the brain craves certainty. So don't take a look at the future with negativity. Take control of your brain and change your belief systems. Get in touch with that story. Do everything that you can. And I'll guarantee you it'll be the most liberating thing that you have to do, and a great step you can take in your development as an authentic leader.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And again, sorry to the audience members, unanswered questions. We do apologize for that, but we've run out of racetrack. Dr. Sagers, would you like to talk about the next session, or should I?
Oh, why don't you talk about it? And I'm not that familiar with it, so.
Okay, perfect. So if you liked this session, and I know I learned a lot, I imagine many of you learned a lot as well. There are several sessions, and the next one is May 25th, Negotiating for Employment, Jobs and Job Offers During a Crisis. So I'm a career advisor, and I can tell you obviously that the entire job market landscape has completely changed. And this is something, if it's impacting you, whether you're an employer or an employee, or you're looking for work, this is a session you don't want to miss. So we hope to see you there at the next webinar. And with that, I'd like to thank you both again. It was wonderful, and it's a conversation I'm sure that could go on. Like I mentioned, I really do appreciate your time and the fact that you've gone over time to answer people's questions, and you gave us a lot of tips that we could use during this uncertain time. So thank you both again.
Great, thanks,
thank you,
Rosalia.
it's our pleasure.
Yeah, oh, thanks everyone.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.